The rain lashed against the windshield, reducing visibility to a blur of streetlights and reflections on the drenched asphalt. Ethan Carter tightened his grip on the steering wheel as his car glided through the near-empty streets of Seattle. The storm was relentless, but he barely noticed. For years, Ethan had perfected the art of tuning out the world. The hum of the engine, the drumming of the rain, it all faded into the background noise of his mind. What filled his thoughts was always the same: the accident that had shattered his life a decade ago, his wife, Claire, and their 5-year-old son, Michael, gone in an instant. Since then, Ethan had buried himself in work, building his empire brick by brick, dollar by dollar. The world saw him as a success story, a self-made millionaire who had everything. But inside, he was hollow, existing rather than living. A flash of movement on the sidewalk caught his attention. Slowing the car as he approached a red light, Ethan squinted through the rain. A young woman stood beneath the meager shelter of a bus stop awning, clutching a baby in her arms. Her soaked jacket clung to her thin frame, and the blanket wrapped around the child looked barely enough to keep out the cold. The scene struck him, a fragile silhouette against the unforgiving storm. Ethan felt a pang in his chest, an ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Compassion wasn't something he was used to anymore, but at that moment, he couldn't ignore it. Without fully thinking, he pulled the car over and rolled down the window. "Miss," he called out, his voice barely carrying over the pounding rain. The woman flinched and turned to face him. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of caution and desperation. "You shouldn't be out here. Do you need help?" She hesitated, clutching the baby closer. "We're fine," she said, though her trembling voice betrayed her words. "You're not fine," Ethan replied firmly, stepping out of the car. The rain immediately soaked through his coat, but he didn't care. He took a step closer, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Please, just listen. I live a few blocks away. My house is warm, dry, and safe. Take my keys and go there." Her eyes darted between him and the car, then to the baby, who let out a small whimper. "I can't," she said, shaking her head. "I don't know you." Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet and flipping it open to reveal his driver's license. "My name is Ethan Carter. I'm not a threat. Look, I'm just asking you to take shelter for the baby's sake, please." The woman bit her lip, her resolve visibly crumbling. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan handed her the keys and gave her his address. "There's a security code for the front door, 1108. Just get inside. Warm up and I'll be back in a few hours." She murmured her thanks again before hurrying toward the car. Ethan watched as she drove off, disappearing into the rain, climbing back into his own vehicle. He felt a strange sense of calm. It was the first impulsive thing he'd done in years, and for once, it felt right. Hours later, Ethan returned home, his coat dripping water onto the polished hardwood floors. The mansion was quiet, save for the faint hum of the heating system. He shook off his umbrella and made his way toward the living room, unsure of what he'd find. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. The woman was curled up on the leather couch, fast asleep, with the baby nestled against her chest. A soft glow from the fireplace illuminated the scene, casting flickering shadows across the room. Ethan's heart clenched at the sight. There was something so peaceful, so achingly familiar about the way she held the child. As he stepped closer, his eyes fell on the baby's neck. A small silver necklace gleamed in the dim light, the pendant resting just above the infant's chest. Ethan froze. He knew that pendant. He'd had it custom-made years ago, a one-of-a-kind piece that he'd given to his son. Michael, on his 5th birthday, he could still see it in his mind's eye, the delicate chain and the small, intricately designed charm. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't possible, was it? Ethan crouched down, trying to get a closer look without waking them. The pendant was identical. There was no question. His heart raced, memories crashing over him like waves. The birthday party, Michael's laughter, Claire's warm smile as they watched their son unwrap his gift, and then the accident, the wreckage, the devastating loss that followed. He'd been told there were no survivors, but here it was, a piece of that past. Sitting in his living room, Ethan's mind whirled with questions. Who was this woman? How did she come to have the baby? And why did the child have this necklace? The possibilities were too wild to entertain. but the evidence was staring him in the face. Taking a step back, Ethan rubbed a hand over his face. He needed answers, but not tonight. The woman and the baby were safe for now, and he didn't have the heart to wake them. Turning away, he retreated to his study. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, staring into its amber depths as though it held the answers. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something had shifted. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something stir within him. Hope, uncertainty, and a faint, fragile connection. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd start asking questions. Morning light filtered through the large windows of Ethan's living room, casting a soft glow over the still sleeping woman and baby. Ethan stood silently in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, watching as the pair began to stir. The woman blinked groggily, her expression shifting to one of alarm when she realized where she was. "It's okay," Ethan said gently, stepping forward to ease her nerves. "You're safe." She sat up, cradling the baby protectively. I didn't mean to fall asleep," she said, her voice shaky. "We'll leave now. Thank you for letting us stay." Ethan shook his head, setting his coffee down on the nearby table. "There's no rush. You needed the rest, and the storm hasn't fully cleared yet." She hesitated, as if weighing his sincerity, before giving a small nod. The baby, nestled against her shoulder, let out a tiny yawn, and Ethan couldn't help but smile. "What's his name?" he asked. "Lucas," she replied, adjusting the blanket around the child. "I named him Lucas." Ethan raised an eyebrow at her choice of words. "You named him. So, he's not your son." The woman's grip on the baby tightened slightly, and she looked away. "No," she admitted softly. "I found him." That single sentence was enough to send 1,000 thoughts racing through Ethan's mind. "You found him," he repeated, his tone calm but probing. "Where?" She glanced back at him, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "In a church," she said. "It was months ago, near Portland. I was staying there temporarily when I heard crying late at night. I went to check, and there he was, wrapped in a blanket, all alone. There was a note with him, but it didn't say much." Ethan leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What did the note say?" "It just said that his parents had been victims of a tragedy, and that someone was trying to protect him. There were no names, no details, nothing else." She paused, her voice faltering. "I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't just leave him there, so I took him with me." Ethan's gaze shifted to the baby. Now wide awake and staring up at the ceiling with innocent curiosity, his tiny hand reached for the silver necklace around his neck, the pendant catching the light. The sight made Ethan's throat tighten. "Where did he get that necklace?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Emily followed his gaze to the pendant. "It was with him when I found him," she said simply. "I thought it might be a clue to who he is." Ethan exhaled slowly, his thoughts swirling. This was no ordinary coincidence. He could feel it in his gut, an unshakable certainty that this child was connected to his past. But how and why now, after all these years? "Do you know anything else about him? Anything at all?" Ethan pressed, his intensity making Emily shift uncomfortably. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I've been trying to keep him safe, but I don't have answers. I'm sorry." Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. He needed answers, and he knew where to start. "Emily," he said carefully, his tone softening, "would you mind if I tried to help? I can hire someone to look into this. Someone who might be able to find out where Lucas came from." Emily hesitated, clearly torn. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice laced with both suspicion and gratitude. "You've already done so much for us." Ethan's eyes locked on hers. "Because I think Lucas might be connected to someone I lost a long time ago. Someone very important to me." She studied him for a long moment, before nodding slowly. "Okay," she said, "if you think it could help." Later that day, Ethan made the call to a private investigator he trusted implicitly. Parker, a gruff but sharp-witted man in his 50s, listened carefully as Ethan explained the situation. "A baby with a necklace identical to your son's," Parker repeated, his tone skeptical but intrigued. "That's a hell of a coincidence." "I don't believe in coincidences," Ethan replied firmly. "I need you to dig into this. Start with the church where Emily found him. There's got to be something there." "All right," Parker said. "I'll get on it. But I have to warn you, cases like this can get messy. You sure you want to dig up the past?" "I don't have a choice," Ethan said quietly. "Just keep me updated." Hanging up the phone, Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring out the window as the rain began to ease. He felt a strange mix of hope and dread. If Lucas truly was connected to his son, it could mean reopening wounds he'd spent years trying to close. But if there was even a chance, he had to know. That evening, as Emily sat in the living room with Lucas, Ethan joined them, his expression softer than it had been in years. "Thank you," he said suddenly. Emily looked up, startled. "For what?" "For taking care of him," Ethan said, gesturing to Lucas. "For giving him a chance when no one else would." Emily's lips curved into a small, shy smile. "He's a good baby," she said. "He's given me as much as I've given him." Ethan nodded, his gaze lingering on the child. "Maybe more than you realize." Ethan stood by the large bay window of his study, watching the rain taper off into a soft drizzle. The previous night's storm had left behind glistening streets and dampened skies. But his thoughts were anything but clear. Parker had promised to start digging immediately, but waiting for answers was something Ethan had never been good at. Downstairs, the sound of Lucas's giggles echoed faintly. Pulling Ethan from his thoughts, he descended the staircase to find Emily seated on the floor, entertaining the baby with a set of blocks Ethan hadn't realized he still had in the house. Lucas clapped his tiny hands in delight as the blocks tumbled down, his laughter lighting up the room. "You found those?" Ethan asked, leaning against the doorframe. Emily looked up, slightly embarrassed. "They were in a closet upstairs. I hope you don't mind. He's been a little restless." Ethan shook his head. "Not at all. It's good to see them being used again." There was a brief pause, the kind that felt heavy with unspoken words. Emily broke the silence. "You're really going to look into his past?" "Aren't you?" "I am," Ethan said, his tone steady but soft. "I need to know who he is, where he came from, and if there's even the slightest chance he's connected to me, I can't let it go." Emily nodded slowly, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "I just hope you're ready for whatever you might find. Sometimes answers aren't what we expect or want." Ethan considered her words, realizing she spoke from experience. He didn't press her, though. Whatever burdens she carried, he knew she'd reveal them in her own time. Hours later, Ethan received a call from Parker. The investigator's voice was gruff but efficient, as always. "I've started tracing the church Emily mentioned. It's in a small town near Portland. I spoke to a few people there, an elderly caretaker and some locals. They remember a baby being left there, but no one saw who dropped him off. The note Emily mentioned was real, though vague." Ethan gripped the phone tighter. "What about the necklace? Any leads?" "Not yet," Parker admitted. "But I've got a theory. It's not the kind of thing you'd find at a department store. Looks custom made. I'll see if I can track down the jeweler." "Do it," Ethan said, his voice firm. "And keep me updated." Hanging up, Ethan felt a mix of hope and frustration. He wanted answers now, but patience was the price of clarity. Meanwhile, Emily busied herself with Lucas in the kitchen. She had started preparing a simple meal when Ethan joined her, his expression unreadable. "Anything new?" she asked cautiously. "Not much yet," he replied. "But Parker's working on it. He's good at what he does." Emily gave a faint smile. "That's good. Lucas deserves to know where he comes from." "And so do you," Ethan added. The words hung in the air, heavier than he'd intended. Emily glanced at him, her brows furrowed in slight confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean you've been carrying this burden alone," Ethan said. "Raising him, protecting him, even when you had nothing yourself. You deserve answers just as much as he does." Emily didn't respond right away. Instead, she stirred the pot on the stove, her movements deliberate. "I never thought of it that way," she finally admitted. "I just did what I thought was right. And you did more than most would," Ethan said sincerely. "It's not easy to put someone else's life above your own." Emily shrugged, but there was a flicker of emotion in her eyes. "I didn't really have much of a life to begin with. He gave me a purpose." Ethan's gaze softened. For the first time, He truly saw her not just as the woman he'd helped on a stormy night, but as someone with strength, resilience, and an unshakable sense of compassion. That evening, Ethan received another call from Parker. "I found the jeweler," Parker announced. "The necklace was custom-made in a small workshop in downtown Seattle about 6 years ago. Sound familiar?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "It's the same one I had made for my son," he confirmed. "I'd recognize it anywhere." "Then we're on the right track," Parker said. "But here's where it gets tricky. The shopkeeper remembers making a duplicate around 3 years ago. He didn't ask questions. It was a paid commission, nothing illegal. But whoever requested it didn't leave much of a trail." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. 3 years ago, he echoed. That timeline didn't make sense. Michael had been gone far longer than that. "Yeah, I'll dig deeper," Parker said. "There's gotta be more to this." "Thanks, Parker," Ethan said, ending the call. As he set the phone down, his mind swirled with questions. Why had someone commissioned a replica of the necklace? And how had it ended up with Lucas? The mystery was growing more complex, and Ethan knew he was just scratching the surface. After dinner, Ethan sat with Emily and Lucas in the living room. The baby had fallen asleep in Emily's arms, his tiny fist clutching the necklace as if it were a lifeline. "Parker's found a lead," Ethan said quietly. "The necklace was duplicated 3 years ago." Emily's brow furrowed. 3 years, but why would someone do that? "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but we're going to find out." Emily nodded, her eyes drifting to the sleeping child. "Whatever happens," she murmured, "thank you for doing this. For him." Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out and gently touched the baby's hand, his expression unreadable. "It's not just for him," he said softly. "It's for all of us." The sun peeked through the clouds the next morning, casting streaks of light into Ethan's mansion. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet stillness. Yet inside the house, a new kind of tension began to take root. Ethan could feel it brewing, though he wasn't sure from where. Emily was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, while Lucas babbled happily in his high chair. Ethan sipped his coffee, his mind still on Parker's latest discovery about the necklace. He glanced at Emily, who seemed more at ease this morning, and decided not to mention it just yet. There was no point in adding to her stress before they had concrete answers. But not everyone in the house shared Ethan's trust in Emily. It started subtly. Ethan's longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Harper, had always been loyal, but her demeanor toward Emily had grown colder since her arrival. At first, it was the occasional glance of disapproval, or the tight-lipped silence when Emily entered a room. Now, her suspicion was harder to ignore. Ethan noticed it during breakfast when Mrs. Harper bustled into the dining room to clear the table. Her gaze lingered on Emily, her lips pursed as though she was holding back a comment. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper," Emily said politely, trying to bridge the awkwardness. The housekeeper nodded curtly but said nothing, her movements brisk and mechanical. Ethan frowned, setting his coffee cup down. "Mrs. Harper, is something wrong?" he asked. "No, Mr. Carter," she replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Just making sure everything is in order." Ethan didn't press further, but the interaction left a bad taste in his mouth. He made a mental note to address it later. As the day wore on, Mrs. Harper's behavior became more apparent. She avoided Emily whenever possible, and when she couldn't, her words were clipped and borderline accusatory. Ethan caught snippets of it while walking past the kitchen. "I've worked here for 20 years, Mrs. Harper said to one of the other staff members, her voice low but sharp. "And now we have strangers living here. No questions asked. Who knows what kind of trouble they'll bring?" Ethan paused outside the doorway. Irritation bubbling beneath the surface, he stepped into the kitchen, his presence immediately silencing the conversation. "Is there something you'd like to share with me, Mrs. Harper?" he asked, his tone firm. The housekeeper turned, her face flushing. "No, Mr. Carter," she said quickly. "Just discussing the changes around here." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "If you have concerns, you bring them to me. Gossiping with the staff is unacceptable." "Yes, sir," she murmured, lowering her gaze. Ethan didn't miss the sideways glance she shot at Emily before leaving the room. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. This was a complication he didn't need. Later that evening, as Emily sat on the couch with Lucas, Ethan joined her, his expression thoughtful. "I need to ask you something," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Has anyone in the house made you feel unwelcome?" Emily hesitated, her hands tightening slightly around Lucas. "I didn't want to say anything," she admitted, "but Mrs. Harper doesn't seem to like me very much." "She's being unprofessional," Ethan said firmly. "I'll deal with it." "You don't have to," Emily said quickly. "I don't want to cause any trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Ethan replied. "You're my guest, and you're here for a reason. That should be enough for everyone." Emily gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," Ethan nodded, though he knew this wouldn't be an easy fix. Mrs. Harper had been with him for years, and while her loyalty was undeniable, her mistrust of Emily could create unnecessary tension. The tension came to a head the next morning. Ethan was in his study reviewing some paperwork. When Mrs. Harper knocked on the door, she stepped inside, her expression a mixture of hesitation and resolve. "Mr. Carter," she began. "I need to speak with you about Miss Emily." Ethan set his pen down, leaning back in his chair. "Go on." "I don't mean to overstep," she said, "but I can't help feeling that there's something off about her. She appears out of nowhere with a baby, and now she's living here. It's not my place, but I'm worried about your safety and your reputation." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Harper, I appreciate your concern, but Emily and Lucas are here because I asked them to be. That's all you need to know." Mrs. Harper hesitated, clearly torn. "I just think you should be cautious, sir." "Thank you," Ethan said curtly, signaling the conversation was over. "I'll handle it," as she left the room. Ethan let out a frustrated sigh. He knew Mrs. Harper meant well, but her attitude was making an already complicated situation more difficult. And that evening, as Emily tucked Lucas into the crib Ethan had set up in one of the guest rooms, she noticed the strain in Ethan's expression when he joined her. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Just some tension with the staff. Nothing for you to worry about." Emily looked unconvinced. "If it's about me..." "It's not," Ethan interrupted. "And even if it was, it's my house. I decide who stays." Emily smiled faintly, though her eyes were shadowed with doubt. "Thank you for everything." Ethan gave a small nod, his gaze lingering on Lucas. "He's a lucky kid," he said, "and so am I." The words surprised even him, but as he left the room, he realized they were true. For the first time in years, his house didn't feel so empty. The morning air in Seattle carried a crisp chill, a stark contrast to the warmth growing within Ethan's home. Despite lingering tension between Emily and the staff, Ethan remained focused on uncovering Lucas's origins. His call with Parker the previous evening had left him with more questions than answers, but a faint hope still stirred in his chest. The necklace was a connection, one he couldn't ignore. Ethan found Emily in the kitchen, sipping tea while Lucas napped in the nearby crib. Her eyes looked distant, her thoughts seemingly far away. "Good morning," Ethan said, breaking the silence as he entered. Emily glanced up, offering a small smile. "Morning. Did you sleep well?" "Well enough," he replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "I spoke with Parker last night. He found the jeweler who made Lucas's necklace." Emily's eyebrows lifted. "And did he find anything?" Ethan nodded. "The necklace is identical to the one I had made for my son, Michael. But there's something strange. The jeweler made a duplicate about 3 years ago." Emily's face fell into confusion. 3 years ago? That's after the accident, right? "Long after," Ethan confirmed. "Parker's trying to trace who commissioned it. It might give us a lead." Emily fell silent, her hands tightening around her mug. "Do you really think Lucas could be connected to your son?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but I'm starting to think it's more than just coincidence." Later that day, Parker called with an update. Ethan stepped into his study, eager for answers. "I spoke to the jeweler again," Parker began, his tone brisk. "He remembers the man who commissioned the duplicate. Said he was in his 40s, seemed nervous and paid in cash. No name, no ID." Ethan frowned. "That doesn't help much." "Not yet," Parker said, "but there's more. The jeweler kept a rough sketch of the original design in his archives. It's the exact same pendant you described. Custom. One of a kind. Whoever this man was, he knew about your son's necklace." Ethan's heart raced. Did he say anything else? Just that the guy seemed insistent on keeping things quiet. almost paranoid. "I'll keep digging, but it's a thin trail. Keep me posted," Ethan said, hanging up. He sat back in his chair, his mind spinning. Someone had gone out of their way to replicate the necklace. But why? And how did Lucas end up with it? That evening, Ethan shared the new information with Emily. They sat in the living room, the fire crackling softly as Lucas slept in Emily's lap. So someone specifically had the necklace copied, Emily mused, her brow furrowed. But why would they do that? "I don't know," Ethan said, staring into the fire. But it wasn't an accident. Someone knew what they were doing. Emily traced the edge of Lucas's blanket absent-mindedly. "Do you think maybe they were trying to protect him, like the note said?" "It's possible," Ethan replied. "But it raises more questions. Who were they protecting him from, and why didn't they come forward?" Emily sighed, looking down at Lucas. "Whoever they were, they saved him. That's what matters." Ethan nodded, though unease still tugged at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was closer than he realized, and far more complicated than he was prepared for. The next day, Parker's investigation took an unexpected turn. When Ethan answered his call, the urgency in the detective's voice was unmistakable. "Ethan, I found something," Parker said. "The church where Lucas was left. It wasn't random. The caretaker remembers seeing a man hanging around the area a few days before the baby was found. He didn't think much of it at the time, but he says the man was carrying a small bundle like a baby." Ethan gripped the phone tightly. "Did he get a good look at him?" "Not really," Parker admitted. "But he did remember one thing. The man had a scar on his left cheek." Ethan's mind raced. It wasn't much to go on, but it was a start. "Can you follow up on that? Maybe check nearby security cameras or witnesses." "I'm already on it," Parker said. "This could take some time, though. Whoever this guy is, he's not making it easy." Ethan thanked him and hung up, his thoughts swirling. A man with a scar, a duplicated necklace, a baby left at a church. The pieces were there, but the picture they formed was still unclear. That evening, Ethan found himself sitting in Lucas's room, watching the baby sleep. Emily had stepped out to take a walk, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he studied Lucas's peaceful expression. "Who are you, little guy?" he murmured. "And why do I feel like you're the answer to a question I didn't even know I was asking?" The sound of the front door opening pulled Ethan from his reverie. Emily returned, her cheeks flushed from the crisp evening air. She joined him in Lucas's room, taking a seat on the chair beside him. "I needed some fresh air," she said softly. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked. Emily nodded, though her expression was pensive. "I've just been thinking about all of this, about how my life has changed since I found him." "It's a lot," Ethan said, his voice gentle. "For both of us." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "I just want to do what's best for him, no matter what that means." "So do I," Ethan said, meeting her gaze. "And we'll figure it out, together." As the night deepened, Ethan felt a strange sense of clarity. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was walking it alone. The next morning, the mansion buzzed with activity as the house staff went about their usual routines. The tension from Mrs. Harper's unease toward Emily seemed to have spread, infecting the atmosphere of the once serene home. Ethan, determined to maintain peace, kept an eye on the interactions between Emily and the staff. Emily, ever aware of the growing hostility, carried Lucas to the sunlit sitting room. She spread a blanket on the floor and set Lucas down with a few toys Ethan had found in a storage closet. Lucas babbled happily, oblivious to the unease around him. Emily sat nearby, sipping tea and trying to ignore the undercurrent of suspicion she felt from the staff. "Good morning, Miss Emily," Mrs. Harper said as she entered the room, her tone clipped but polite enough. "I see you've made yourself at home." Emily stiffened but forced a smile. "Just keeping Lucas entertained." "Of course," Mrs. Harper replied, her gaze lingering on Lucas before sweeping over to Emily's belongings piled neatly in the corner. "You've certainly brought a lot with you." Emily's cheeks flushed. "It's just a few things we needed." Mrs. Harper's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, let me know if you need help finding more space." The veiled comment wasn't lost on Emily, but she held her tongue. Lucas let out a joyful squeal, drawing both women's attention. Mrs. Harper's expression softened briefly before she straightened and excused herself. Later that day, Ethan returned from a meeting to find Emily pacing in the kitchen, her face tight with frustration. "Everything okay?" he asked, stepping in. Emily turned to him, clearly upset. "Ethan, I don't want to cause problems, but I think Mrs. Harper doesn't trust me. She's been watching me. It's uncomfortable." Ethan frowned. "I've noticed. I'll talk to her again." Emily sighed, her hands wringing. "I don't want to create drama, but it's hard to feel welcome when I know she's suspicious of me." "You are welcome here," Ethan said firmly. "And I'll make sure Mrs. Harper knows that." Emily gave him a small, grateful nod, but the unease lingered in her posture. The next morning, the tension came to a head. Mrs. Harper approached Ethan while he was in his study, her expression troubled. "Mr. Carter," she began, hesitating slightly. "I didn't want to bring this to your attention, but I've noticed something concerning." Ethan set down the document he was reading. "What is it?" Mrs. Harper shifted uncomfortably. "Some of the silverware from the dining room is missing, and I couldn't help but notice that Miss Emily has been spending a lot of time near the storage areas." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing Emily of stealing?" "I'm not accusing anyone," Mrs. Harper said quickly. "I'm just saying it's worth looking into." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. "I'll handle it." Mrs. Harper nodded and left the room, but Ethan remained seated, frustration building within him. He didn't believe Emily was capable of stealing, but the seed of doubt Mrs. Harper had planted was difficult to ignore. And that afternoon, Ethan approached Emily, determined to clear the air. "Emily," he began cautiously, "can we talk?" Emily looked up from where she was playing with Lucas. "Of course, what's wrong?" Ethan hesitated. "Mrs. Harper mentioned something about missing items from the house, she thinks. She thinks you might know something about it." Emily's face fell, her eyes widening in disbelief. "She thinks I stole something." "I don't believe it," Ethan said quickly. "But I need to ask, just to put the issue to rest." Emily's hands clenched into fists. "Ethan, I would never do that. I can't believe she would accuse me of something like this." "I know," Ethan said, his tone firm but calm. "I trust you, but I need to address this to make sure it doesn't escalate." Emily stood, holding Lucas protectively. "Fine, look through my things if you have to. I have nothing to hide." Ethan felt a pang of guilt at the hurt in her voice, but nodded. "Thank you, I'll handle it." Ethan called the staff together later that evening, determined to get to the bottom of the accusations. "Mrs. Harper," he said firmly, "you brought this issue to my attention. Do you have any proof that Emily is involved?" Mrs. Harper shifted uncomfortably. "Not directly, sir, but—" "Then let me make this clear," Ethan interrupted. "Emily is here because I invited her, until there's evidence to suggest otherwise. I won't tolerate baseless accusations. Am I understood?" "Yes, sir," Mrs. Harper murmured, though her expression remained troubled. The following day, the situation took an unexpected turn. While tidying the dining room, one of the junior staff members discovered a stash of silverware hidden behind a decorative panel. Ethan was informed immediately, and when he examined the items, it became clear that someone had been attempting to frame Emily. Ethan wasted no time confronting Mrs. Harper. "Care to explain how these ended up hidden in the dining room?" he demanded, holding up one of the recovered pieces. Mrs. Harper's face went pale. I don't know, sir. I've been loyal to this house for years. I would never—" "Loyalty doesn't excuse this," Ethan snapped. "If I find out you had anything to do with this, there will be consequences." Mrs. Harper stammered out a denial, but Ethan wasn't convinced. The incident only deepened his resolve to protect Emily and Lucas from any further hostility. Bustigini matter that evening, Ethan shared the news with Emily. "We found the missing silverware," he said. "It was hidden in the dining room. Someone was trying to set you up." Emily's eyes widened. "Why would anyone do that?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but it won't happen again." Emily's shoulders sagged with relief, though the lingering fear in her eyes was hard to miss. "Thank you for believing me." Ethan reached out, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. You're part of this house now, and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure you feel safe here, for the first time in days." Emily smiled, a small but genuine expression of gratitude. Ethan returned the gesture, silently vowing to uncover the truth. no matter how complicated it became. The morning sun poured through the large windows of Ethan's study as he sat at his desk, mulling over the events of the previous day. The discovery of the hidden silverware had been a small victory, but the tension in the house remained palpable. Ethan knew he couldn't allow it to fester. The sooner the real culprit was identified, the better. For everyone involved. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his concentration. It was Parker. "Morning," Ethan greeted, his voice steady but expectant. "Got an update for you," Parker said. "I managed to pull some surveillance footage from the area around the church where Lucas was left. It's not the best quality, but I think we've got something useful." Ethan straightened in his chair. "What did you find?" "There's a figure on the footage. A man carrying what looks like a small bundle. It matches the caretaker's description, down to the scar on his cheek. The footage doesn't show his face clearly, but it's something. Anything else?" Ethan pressed. "Yeah, I traced the man's movements through the area. He boarded a bus heading toward Tacoma. I'm working on getting more footage from the transit system, but it's slow going." Ethan nodded, though Parker couldn't see him. "Keep me posted and thanks." After hanging up, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The man in the footage might hold the answers they needed, but the trail was still tenuous. He would need patience, a commodity he was running out of. Meanwhile, downstairs, Emily tried to focus on Lucas as he played with a set of wooden blocks on the living room floor. Despite Ethan's reassurance the night before, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time she passed Mrs. Harper or another staff member, she felt their eyes linger just a moment too long. "Hey," Ethan's voice broke through her thoughts as he entered the room. He carried a small box, which he set down on the coffee table. Emily looked up, curious. "What's that?" "I thought it was time Lucas had something more fitting for a child his age," Ethan said, opening the box to reveal a collection of new toys, brightly colored and well-made. They were a stark contrast to the hand-me-downs Lucas had been playing with. Emily's face softened. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Ethan replied simply. "He deserves it." Lucas let out a delighted squeal as Ethan handed him a soft plush bear. Watching the child's joy, Ethan felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. It was as though Lucas's laughter had the power to fill the empty spaces in his heart. Emily, however, seemed hesitant. "Ethan," she began carefully, "I appreciate everything you've done for us, but I can't help feeling like this isn't just about Lucas." Ethan met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said slowly, "I feel like you're searching for something more than just answers about him." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're right," he admitted. "Lucas reminds me of someone I lost, someone I thought I'd never see again. And that necklace, it's not just a coincidence." Emily's breath hitched. "You really think he's your son?" "I don't know," Ethan said honestly. "But if there's even a chance, I have to find out." That afternoon, Parker called again with more news. Ethan excused himself from Emily and Lucas, stepping into his study to take the call. "I got lucky," Parker began. "Managed to track down more footage. The guy with the scar got off the bus in Tacoma and went into a small motel. I spoke to the manager, and he remembered the guy renting a room there for a couple of nights." "Did he leave anything behind?" Ethan asked, his pulse quickening. "Not much. But the manager mentioned something interesting. The guy was seen carrying a small box when he left. A box the manager said looked like it might hold jewelry." Ethan's mind immediately went to the necklace. "Do you have a name?" "Not yet," Parker admitted. "The guy paid cash and didn't leave any ID. But I'm working on it." "Good," Ethan said. "Keep digging." As he hung up, Ethan felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting into place. Whoever this man was, he had to know something, and Ethan was determined to find him. That evening, as the household settled into its usual routine, Ethan called a meeting with the staff. He stood at the head of the dining room table, his presence commanding but calm. "I want to address the issue from yesterday," he began. "The silverware was found hidden in the dining room, and it's clear someone was trying to frame Emily. I won't tolerate that kind of behavior in my house." The staff exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. "If anyone here has information about this," Ethan continued, his voice firm, "now is the time to come forward. Mrs. Harper shifted in her seat, her discomfort evident. Ethan's gaze landed on her, and for a moment, the room was silent. "I hope I've made myself clear," Ethan said finally. "This is your last chance to resolve this matter quietly." When no one responded, Ethan dismissed the staff, his frustration simmering just below the surface. He needed to get to the bottom of this, not just for Emily, but for the stability of his home. As the night wore on, Ethan found himself in Lucas's room once again. The baby was fast asleep, his tiny hand clutching the silver necklace. Emily stood beside the crib, her expression a mix of exhaustion and quiet resolve. "You didn't have to do all that," she said softly, referring to the staff meeting. "Yes, I did," Ethan replied. "You and Lucas deserve better than this." Emily glanced at him, her eyes glistening. "I don't know why you believe in us so much, but thank you." Ethan smiled faintly. "Sometimes you just know when something, or someone, matters." As they stood in the quiet glow of the nursery, both of them felt the weight of their journey so far. The answers were out there, waiting to be uncovered, and together, they were ready to face whatever truths lay ahead. The next morning brought a rare moment of calm to the mansion. Emily sat on the back patio with Lucas on her lap, the soft morning breeze brushing against her face. The weight of the previous days lingered, but she tried to focus on the simple joy of Lucas's giggles as he reached for a butterfly fluttering by. Ethan stepped outside, his presence quiet but grounding. He held 2 steaming mugs of coffee, handing one to Emily before settling into the chair beside her. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her a small smile. "Thanks," Emily replied, taking the mug. The warmth seeped into her hands, offering comfort. They sat in silence for a moment, watching Lucas wriggle with excitement at the sights and sounds of the garden. "You're good with him," Ethan said suddenly, his tone thoughtful. Emily glanced at him, surprised. "I just do my best. He makes it easy." "It's more than that," Ethan said, his gaze steady. "You've given him something I thought I'd lost a long time ago. A sense of home." Emily looked down, her fingers tracing the edge of the mug. "I guess I've been searching for that, too." Ethan hesitated, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Emily, I need to tell you something about why Lucas means so much to me." She met his gaze, her expression soft but curious. "I'm listening." And for the next hour, Ethan shared the story he had kept buried for so long. He spoke of Claire, his wife, whose laughter had been the light of his life. He described Michael, their son, with his boundless energy and curious spirit. And finally, he recounted the day everything changed, the accident that took them both from him. "I thought I'd lost them forever," Ethan said. Ethan, his voice heavy with emotion. "But when I saw that necklace on Lucas, it felt like a piece of them was still here, like there might be a connection I never imagined." Emily listened intently, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Ethan, I'm so sorry for everything you've been through. I can't imagine that kind of pain." Ethan offered her a faint smile. "You've been through your own struggles. I see it in the way you protect Lucas, the way you hold yourself together even when things are hard." Emily looked away, her jaw tightening. "I guess I've always felt like I had to. I didn't have anyone else to lean on." "You do now," Ethan said firmly. "We're in this together, Emily." Her lips trembled, but she nodded, grateful for his unwavering support. Later that day, Parker called with another update. Ethan excused himself from Emily and Lucas, stepping into his study to take the call. "I've got a lead," Parker said without preamble. "The man with the scar might have been staying at another motel in Tacoma a few days after leaving the church. I spoke to the clerk there, and he remembered the guy. Said he looked nervous, like he was watching his back." "Did he leave anything behind?" Ethan asked, his pulse quickening. "Not exactly," Parker replied. "But the clerk mentioned something interesting. The man asked for directions to a law office downtown. I'm following up on that now." "A law office," Ethan echoed. "What would he want there?" "Could be anything," Parker said. "Custody papers, legal advice, who knows? But it's a solid lead." "Good," Ethan said. "Keep me updated." As he ended the call, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was still unclear. He needed answers. Soon. Even that evening, As the house grew quiet, Ethan joined Emily and Lucas in the nursery. Lucas was already asleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. Emily stood by the crib, her arms crossed as she watched over him. "He's happy here," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "You've done an incredible job with him." Emily glanced at him, a faint smile on her lips. "I just want him to feel safe. That's all I've ever wanted." Ethan stepped closer, his voice soft. "He's more than safe, Emily. He's loved, and that's because of you." Her eyes shimmered with emotion as she looked at him. "It's because of you, too. You didn't have to take us in, but you did. You've given us more than I ever thought we'd have." Ethan hesitated, then reached out, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "You've given me something too, Hope. For the first time in years, I feel like I have a reason to believe in something again." Emily's breath hitched, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The connection between them, unspoken but undeniable, grew stronger with each passing second. As the night deepened, Ethan found himself reflecting on how far they had come. The mansion, once a cold and empty space, now felt alive with warmth and purpose. And though the answers they sought still eluded them, one thing was certain: they were no longer facing the journey alone. The next morning dawned softly, with sunlight breaking through the clouds and painting the mansion in hues of gold. Ethan sat at the breakfast table, absently stirring his coffee as his thoughts circled the new lead Parker had uncovered. A law office. It seemed like such a mundane place for a man trying to hide a child. Yet, the very mundanity of it might have been deliberate. Emily joined him a few minutes later, carrying Lucas in her arms. The baby squealed with delight as Ethan reached out to take him, lifting him gently into his lap. "He's always happiest in the mornings," Emily said, her tone warm. "He's got the right idea," Ethan replied, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "A fresh start every day." Emily sat down, cradling her mug of tea. "Have you heard anything new from Parker?" "Not yet," Ethan admitted. "He's following up on the law office lead. It might take some time, but I'm confident we'll get something." Emily nodded, though her eyes betrayed her worry. "It feels strange, doesn't it? Knowing there are pieces of Lucas's story out there that we don't understand." Ethan set Lucas back into his high chair, leaning forward slightly. "Strange, yes, but we'll figure it out. We owe it to him." And the day passed quietly. Ethan spent most of the afternoon in his study, going over business documents he had neglected while focusing on Lucas's mystery. Yet his mind kept drifting back to the boy and the lingering question of who the man with the scar might be. Meanwhile, Emily took Lucas outside to the garden. She spread out a blanket beneath the sprawling oak tree and watched as he crawled around, fascinated by the colorful flowers and the gentle hum of bees. "You love it out here, don't you?" she said softly, smiling as Lucas clapped his hands at a butterfly that landed nearby. Mrs. Harper passed by, carrying a basket of fresh laundry. Though her demeanor had softened slightly since the silverware incident, there was still a hint of frostiness in her interactions with Emily. Emily noticed but chose to ignore it, focusing instead on the baby's laughter and the calming sway of the trees. That evening, Ethan received a long-awaited call from Parker. His heart raced as he picked up the phone. "I found something," Parker said without preamble. "The law office the man visited specializes in anonymous guardianship cases. I spoke with one of the clerks there, and she confirmed that a man matching the description you gave filed papers to place a child under temporary care about 3 years ago." Ethan gripped the edge of his desk. "Did he use a name?" "No name," Parker replied. "But he did leave an address. It's in Tacoma near the bus station. I'm heading there now." "Send me the address," Ethan said. "I'm coming too." "You sure about that?" Parker asked. "It might be better if I handle this solo." "This is personal, Parker," Ethan said firmly. "I need to be there." Parker sighed. "All right, I'll text you the details." Ethan hung up and immediately headed for the living room, where Emily sat reading to Lucas. The calm scene almost made him hesitate, but he knew he couldn't delay. "Emily," he said, drawing her attention. "Parker found a lead. I'm going to Tacoma to check it out." Emily's brow furrowed with concern. "You're going alone." "Parker will be there," Ethan assured her. "But this is something I have to do." She stood, setting the book aside. "Be careful, Ethan, and let me know what you find." "I will," he promised, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he turned and left. The drive to Tacoma was quiet, the city lights fading into a dark stretch of highway. Ethan's thoughts churned as he replayed everything they'd uncovered so far. The necklace, the church, the man with the scar, and now this address. The pieces were coming together, but the picture they formed was still incomplete. When he arrived at the address Parker had sent, he found the detective waiting outside a small, rundown apartment building. Parker greeted him with a nod. "This is the place," Parker said, gesturing toward the building. "I spoke to a neighbor. She said the guy hasn't lived here for over a year, but she remembers him, scar and all." "Did she say where he went?" Ethan asked, his heart sinking. "She didn't know," Parker replied, "but she did say something interesting. She saw him leave one day with a child." Ethan's pulse quickened. "A child? Did she describe him?" Parker nodded. "She said he was about a year old, with a silver necklace." The confirmation hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. "Lucas? Seems likely," Parker said. "I'm trying to track down where he might have gone next. But it's a dead end for now." Ethan leaned against the car, his mind spinning. The man with the scar wasn't just a passerby. He had been directly involved in Lucas's life. But why had he left the child at the church? And what was he running from? As Ethan drove back to Seattle later that night, his thoughts turned to Emily. She had been thrust into this mystery as much as he had, and yet her resolve never wavered. He found himself grateful not only for her strength, but for the way she had given Lucas a sense of stability in the chaos. When he arrived home, the house was dark except for the faint glow of a lamp in the living room. Emily was sitting on the couch waiting for him. "Did you find anything?" she asked softly, her expression a mix of hope and fear. Ethan sat down beside her, the weight of the evening pressing on him. The man with the scar lived in Tacoma for a while. He left with Lucas about a year before he was found at the church. "We're still piecing the rest together." Emily's gaze dropped to her hands. "So he really was trying to protect him." "It seems that way," Ethan said, "but we still don't know why." As silence settled between them, Lucas stirred in his crib nearby. Letting out a small whimper, Emily rose to check on him, and Ethan watched her with quiet admiration. Despite everything, she had become the anchor they both needed. "We'll figure it out," Ethan said, more to himself than to her, "no matter what it takes." The following morning, Ethan sat in his study, staring at a map spread across the desk, marked with red circles and lines connecting key locations. It painted a picture of the journey Lucas had unknowingly taken: the church in Portland, the bus stop in Tacoma, and the law office downtown. Yet the most important question remained unanswered. Why? Emily entered the room with Lucas on her hip, the baby babbling happily. "You didn't come down for breakfast," she said softly. Setting Lucas in a playpen nearby, Ethan glanced up, offering a small smile. "Got caught up in all this," he admitted, gesturing toward the map. Emily approached, studying the marks and notes scrawled in the margins. "It's incredible how far he's come, and how much we still don't know." Ethan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "Parker's still looking into the man with the scar. He's our best chance at figuring this out." Emily hesitated, then placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You've done so much for Lucas already. Whatever happens, just know that you've made a difference. For both of us." Ethan met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "We're in this together, Emily. I'm not stopping until we know the truth." And that afternoon, Parker called with an unexpected development. "I tracked down the law office's case files from 3 years ago," Parker said, his tone brisk. "The man with the scar filed guardianship papers under a fake name. But here's the kicker. He listed a contact in Seattle." Ethan sat up straight. "Who?" "It's an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city," Parker replied. "The address checks out, but there's no business registered there anymore." "Might be worth a look." Ethan's mind raced. A lead this close to home couldn't be ignored. "Send me the address. I'll meet you there." "I'll scope it out first," Parker said. "It could be nothing, or it could be dangerous." "I'm coming," Ethan insisted. "I need to see this through." The drive to the warehouse was tense. Emily had wanted to come along, but Ethan convinced her to stay with Lucas, promising to call as soon as he had answers. The thought of leaving them behind felt heavier than he expected, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't just about him. It was about giving Lucas the future he deserved. The warehouse was a crumbling relic of a bygone era, its brick walls streaked with grime and its windows boarded up. Parker stood near the entrance, his arms crossed as he waited. "Place has been abandoned for years," Parker said as Ethan approached. "But I checked the public records. Used to belong to a shipping company that went under a decade ago." "Why would he list this as a contact?" Ethan asked. His brow furrowed. "Only one way to find out," Parker replied, pulling a flashlight from his jacket. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with the smell of mildew. Dust coated every surface, and broken crates littered the floor as they moved deeper into the building. Parker's flashlight caught a glint of something metallic on a nearby table. Ethan stepped closer, his heart pounding as he recognized it immediately. A second silver necklace, identical to the one Lucas wore. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice tight. He was here. Parker examined the necklace, then turned his attention to a small stack of papers beside it. The top sheet was a faded photograph of a young woman holding a baby. Ethan's breath caught. Though the photo was grainy, he recognized Claire's features in the woman's face. "Claire," he whispered. "This must have been taken before the accident." Parker flipped through the other papers, his brow furrowing. "These look like medical records," he said. "There's a name here, Lucas Carter, and a date of birth that matches your son's." Ethan's chest tightened. "He's my son," he said, the realization hitting him like a wave. "Lucas is Michael." Parker placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We need to figure out why the man with the scar was protecting him. These records might have the answers." When Ethan returned home that evening, his emotions were a storm of relief, confusion, and determination. Emily was waiting in the living room, Lucas asleep in her arms. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Ethan sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the baby. "He's my son," he said softly. "Lucas is Michael." Emily's eyes widened, tears brimming as she looked down at the sleeping child. "You're sure?" "There's no doubt," Ethan replied. "But we still don't know why the man with the scar hid him, or why he left him at the church." Emily reached out, placing a hand over Ethan's. "No matter what happens, he's safe now. That's what matters." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. "I won't stop until I find out the truth. Michael deserves that." Later that night, as the house grew quiet, Ethan sat alone in the nursery. Watching Michael sleep, the silver necklace gleamed faintly in the moonlight, a symbol of the journey that had brought them here. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. The answers were close, and with Emily by his side, he knew they would uncover the full truth, together. The following morning, Ethan awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The discovery of Lucas's true identity had lifted a weight he didn't realize he had been carrying for years. Yet, questions still loomed. Who was the man with the scar? And why had he gone to such lengths to protect Michael? Downstairs, Emily was feeding Lucas in the kitchen. The sight filled Ethan with warmth, but also a lingering guilt. He hadn't shared the full story yet. Not the photo of Claire or the medical records Parker had uncovered. "Morning," Emily said softly, smiling as Ethan entered the room. "Morning," he replied. Taking a seat across from her, his gaze rested on Lucas, the boy who had unknowingly brought light back into his life. "How's he doing?" "Happy as ever," Emily said, her tone affectionate. "He doesn't seem to care about all the mysteries surrounding him." Ethan chuckled, though the weight of his thoughts quickly returned. "Emily," he began, "there's more I need to tell you about what we found yesterday." She set down the spoon she'd been using to feed Lucas, her brow furrowing. "What is it?" Ethan leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "Parker found a photo in the warehouse. It was of Claire holding Michael. It confirmed everything." Emily's eyes softened. "I'm so glad you have that connection. It must feel like you're getting a piece of her back." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. "But there's more. There were medical records too, with Michael's name on them. I think the man with the scar knew Claire, or at least knew what happened after the accident." Emily's hand flew to her mouth. "You think she survived? That she was with Michael before he was taken to the church?" "It's possible," Ethan admitted, though his voice wavered. "But if she did, something, or someone, kept her from coming back to me." The realization hung heavy between them, the weight of what might have been pressing against the air. Chew. And later that day, Parker called with the final piece of the puzzle. Ethan stepped into his study, bracing himself for what he might hear. "I found him," Parker said. "The man with the scar. His name is Daniel Rivera, and he worked as a paramedic years ago. He was at the scene of your family's accident." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. "What did he say?" "I spoke to him this morning," Parker continued. "He admitted to taking Michael from the wreckage. He said he found Claire alive but barely hanging on. She made him promise to protect Michael, saying it wasn't safe for him to stay with you." Ethan's heart sank. "Not safe? What did she mean?" "Rivera wouldn't say," Parker replied. "But he hinted that Claire was afraid of someone close to you. He said he left Michael at the church because he couldn't care for him alone and thought it was the best way to keep him hidden." Ethan's mind raced, pieces of the story falling into place. Did Claire survive? "No," Parker said gently. "She died at the scene. Rivera said he did everything he could, but her injuries were too severe." The confirmation hit Ethan like a blow, but alongside the grief came a surge of anger. "Who was she afraid of?" he demanded. "Who could have done this to my family?" "I'm still working on that," Parker said. "But Rivera's willing to meet with you if you want to hear his side." "I'll meet him," Ethan said without hesitation. "Send me the details." Ethan met Daniel Rivera in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. The man was older than Ethan had expected, with weathered features and a haunted look in his eyes. The scar on his cheek was faint now, a reminder of the past he clearly carried heavily. "Mr. Carter," Rivera began, his voice rough but steady. "I owe you an apology." Ethan studied him, his emotions a mix of gratitude and resentment. "You took my son," he said, his tone sharp. "But you also saved him." "I need to know why." Rivera nodded, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "Your wife, Claire, she begged me to take him. She said she didn't trust the people around you. Not your staff, not your business partners. She thought someone would use Michael to hurt you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Did she say who?" "No," Rivera admitted. "But she was terrified. I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping him hidden. When I couldn't care for him anymore, I left him at the church, hoping someone would give him a better life." Ethan leaned back, his mind spinning. Claire's fears suddenly made sense. The attempts to frame Emily, the tension in the house. Someone had been working against him for years, and they had taken everything from him in the process. "Thank you," Ethan said finally, his voice heavy with emotion, "for saving my son. But this isn't over." Rivera nodded solemnly. "I hope you find whoever did this." When Ethan returned home that evening, Emily was waiting in the living room. He sat beside her, the weight of the day evident in his posture. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "I met him," Ethan said. "The man with the scar. He saved Michael because Claire begged him to. She was afraid of someone close to me." Emily's eyes widened. "Do you know who?" "Not yet," Ethan admitted, "but I will, and when I do, they'll answer for what they've done." Emily reached out, taking his hand in hers. "Whatever happens, you have me and Lucas. You're not alone in this." Ethan looked at her, gratitude and determination shining in his eyes. "We'll face this together." As Lucas stirred in his crib nearby, Ethan felt a sense of clarity. The path ahead was uncertain, but with Emily and Michael by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next.